On the Buzz Meter this Sunday, the Russia investigation takes two bizarre twists as the Washington Post reveals that Hillary Clinton's campaign and the DNC funded the research that led to that unsubstantiated dossier about the Kremlin and Donald Trump.
Well, I think it's very sad what they've done with this fake dossier. It was made up, and I understand they paid a tremendous amount of money, and Hillary Clinton always denied it.
The Democrats hired a foreign agent to dig up dirt on Donald Trump. Now, look, that happens all the time in politics, but it seems really seedy.
So we were all worried about this meeting some two-bit Russian lawyer had with Donald Trump Jr. when we had the Democrats paying for a Kremlin designed, in part, dossier that was compiled by this Steele character.
It gives Donald Trump, every Trump ally, a huge card to play to say, told ya, partisan witch hunt. Mueller's investigation is a partisan witch hunt, too.
And a new report says that anti-Trump Oppo firm was originally hired by the Washington Free Beacon. What is a conservative news site doing paying for dirt? A Republican rupture as Senator Jeff Flake announces his resignation by ripping into Trump. And much of the press hails him and Bob Corker as heroes.
The longer we wait, the more this kind of behavior and these kind of politics become normalized, and we can't afford that.
Far beyond a rebuke, and this shows the insanity that has overtaken the Republican Party.
For all you never Trumper senators that are headed for the exits, people like Corker and Flake, you know what? Guess what? You guys, take your other colleagues with you. Mitch McConnell, goodbye. Ben Sasse, goodbye. John Cornyn, goodbye.
So which pundits are right? Are the senators courageous or quitters? Plus, MSNBC suspends Game Change co-author Mark Halperin over sexual harassment allegations, and he loses his book and movie deals after apologizing for misconduct now involving a dozen female accusers. And with new allegations against Harvey Weinstein and so many accusations rocking the media, Hollywood, and corporate America, has there been a cultural game change? I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. That unsubstantiated dossier about President Trump and Russia has gotten enormous media attention, but now the Washington Post disclosing that Hillary Clinton's campaign and the DNC funded that research by spending millions on a law firm that hired an Oppo research outfit, Fusion GPS, which in turn hired an ex-British spy with ties to the FBI who wrote this report.
And I'm glad that some folks in the media are finally talking about the real collusion with Russia, and that is with the Clinton campaign and with the DNC on both of these matters.
So says Sarah Sanders. Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Anna Palmer, reporter for Politico and co-author of the Playbook column. Emily Jashinsky, commentary writer for the Washington Examiner. And Joe Trippi, the Democratic strategist and Fox News contributor. Emily, after months and months of media investigation about alleged collusion between the Trump team and Russia, does this Post story, which drew coverage on all the cable news networks, make it look like Democratic dirt digging?
Yeah, I mean, this was an excellent report in the Washington Post, and it certainly did. It changes the narrative. It means that the media really has to broaden the narrative when it comes to Russian collusion, because we're seeing clearly on both sides there was an interest in going through this route. This was a big thing. It changes how we are going to talk about this for the foreseeable future, and it doesn't make the Democrats look good, I should add.
Joe, you've put plenty of Oppo research out there in your career. Should the media have been more skeptical about this firm, about this ex-British spy, about who was paying for it, as they were dealing with Russians to find out more about the Republican nominee?
No, I don't think so. I think what the media's missed is that, look, all campaigns do this, but no campaign sets out to find fake or phony information. We hire opposition research firms to find true stuff that the other side doesn't want voters to know.
Oh, hold on. When you say all campaigns do this, I would heartily agree with that. Right. But how many campaigns have somebody who's secret, this is all secret, obviously, talking to Kremlin officials? I mean, that has given this an entirely different cast. You seem rather nonchalant about it.
No, that's what's different. It's not about who paid for it. It's about, was the Kremlin, in both campaigns, I mean, was it feeding fake information to Christopher Steele? Was it giving fake information or information in exchange for something for the Trump campaign? That's what it is.
I would dissent that it's not about who paid for it. I think that's crucial. And Anna, some journalists are saying the Democratic lawyer involved lied for a long time about this Fusion GPS. It's a firm founded by former Wall Street Journal reporter Glenn Simpson. New York Times quoting sources is saying Hillary Clinton didn't know about it. Brian Fallon, her former spokesman, now at CNN, saying he didn't know anything about it. Are the media going to aggressively pursue this question of all this money being spent? Who actually knew about it?
Yeah, I actually think that reporters for months have been trying to get to the bottom of who funded this dossier. CNN reported about it a while ago. We at Politico and other outlets went to the Clinton people. They lied. I mean, that's pretty plain and simple that they did not tell the truth about who was funding this. I think you're going to see more reports. There's going to be more digging on this. And I think there'll also be more digging on what happened with the Free Beacon. Why were they, kind of funding this kind of information as well?
Get to that in a second. I do want to mention, people forget that most news organizations wouldn't touch this dossier. It was BuzzFeed that made it public while saying it had no way of confirming whether these allegations were true. And the president tweeting this morning, there's a whole series of them saying it's not coincidental. There's all this focus on phony Trump-Russia stuff when he's trying to get tax reform. There's so much guilt by Democrats. Clinton, says the president. Now the facts are pouring out. Do something. All right, so Washington Free Beacon, Emily, Byron York, who we'll talk to later, broke the story. This is a conservative news website hiring Fusion GPS. The dossier came later, but still, does this raise a credibility issue? Something it's a partisan news organization, but it still does news, hiring one of these shadowy firms.
2 points on this. I think, first of all, the Washington Free Beacon's explanation for what they did was fantastic. They were completely open and honest. They did not run from it. They embraced it. They said this is something that we did. And Trump was not the only subject of the investigation. There were other primary candidates at the time that Fusion GPS was looking into for the Free Beacon. One thing I think the Free Beacon needed to be more careful of is they were reporting about Fusion GPS without disclosing that they had hired Fusion GPS. And that, I think, was problematic. But overall, I thought their explanation was good.
That's a really important point. And look, there's nothing wrong, let's say, with hiring a pollster or some outside firm to help your reporting. When you're hiring a firm that's job it is to dig up dirt, and you're reporting on the controversy, and you're reporting on the firm, you don't disclose that to readers, how is that not a big conflict?
No, that is a big conflict. I mean, there are things there are conflicts going on here. But look, what
so many that it's kind of hard to unravel it all. Even we do this for a living, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But what I think that's happening is, look, if you're trying to find these things down, if you're trying to hunt them down, you go to where they are. I mean, so if the facts are leading you to something Trump in Russia, that's where the Oppo research firm is going to go. I mean, if it's a land deal in the Bahamas, that's where the research firm is going to go. The question is, because this is an internal document. Mm-hmm. To go after negative information. The question is any of it true? Because from a campaign point of view, that's what you want.
Well, that remains the question, is it true?
And that's what we're still hunting down.
Who financed it? No. CNN went wall-to-wall starting Friday night. MSNBC as well, over CNN's report that Robert Mueller has brought his first indictment, except there's this little detail we don't know, like, who is it? Fox had a few mentions, but the next morning, Politico, New York Times, Washington Post didn't have a story. Is it hard to stay away from a story that's not confirmed when it's all over certain cable networks?
Listen, I think that's what we do as reporters, right? You're trying to confirm information. You're trying to be first always, but you also have to be right. And so I think, we want to try to this is going to be huge. What happens on Monday? What happens with this probe? Everybody's focused on it. Obviously, the president is tweeting about it as well.
Might not be that huge, depending on who it is. It could be some lower-level person, or it could be Paul Manafort. I don't want to speculate, but yeah, I actually admire news organizations that held back without having it confirmed. Let me move now to all the Republican infighting. Steve Bannon, who was not a household name before during the Trump campaign, I mean, he's now turned himself into a major media figure, working the press, using Breitbart as his platform, and recruiting candidates against the Republican establishment. So has he become a media and political force in this cycle?
Absolutely. There's no question about it. And he's actually really, I think, adept media manipulator. I think he knows when to see narratives that are going to energize his base, energize what's really become the Trump base. And that gets back to the president and how the president sets the narrative. It's huge. He's very, very adept.
Do you say that media manipulator kind of admiringly, or as an insult?
Well, it depends on how he's doing. So I'm a conservative, and sometimes I think, the narratives that he latches onto are very true and are very helpful, and there aren't a lot of other people who would be calling them out. And so in certain circumstances, as a conservative, absolutely.
Joe, as an operative who became kind of famous when you were running the Howard Dean campaign, you're known around the world. Is it a mixed blessing? Infamous, so we'll go with that. Is it a mixed blessing when the operative is a bigger media figure than the candidates he's trying to recruit?
Oh, no, that's definitely the case. I mean, that can be a problem. But look, I think Steve Bannon was a force way before the Trump campaign. I mean, he had a lot to do with setting the agenda. And
it just wasn't as high profile.
It wasn't as high profile. Now that he is, it's clear that he's even more, I think, even more powerful and even having a bigger effect, particularly within the Republican Party.
On the lead story in the Washington Post the other day, Republicans target Bannon. This was GOP establishment hitting back against Bannon, who hasn't exactly been shy about his criticism. Do Steve Bannon's efforts to recruit candidates to knock off some of these establishment Republicans or Trump-unfriendly Republicans, they warrant that kind of media treatment? In other words, is it as big a deal, or do we just like writing and talking about Bannon?
I think anytime there's tension, right, there's a bias in the media for a fight that's happening, that's brewing. Imagine if Rahm Emanuel went out when Clinton was in the president and said, I'm going to recruit candidates that you don't want. I mean, I think that is just, there's inherent tension there, and it's obviously very interesting, and we're following this on a day-by-day, minute-by-minute basis.
What you're saying is it's a really good story. All right, let me get a break. mediabuzz at foxnews.com if you want to let us know what you think. When we come back, the war of words between the president and two Republican senators. Is it the civil war being trumpeted by the press? And later, MSNBC suspends a top contributor as more sexual harassment allegations hit the headlines. The press has branded it a Republican civil war this after two senators, Jeff Flake and Bob Corker, ratcheted up their rhetoric against President Trump, triggering an avalanche of coverage.
It's difficult to win a Republican primary these days if you disagree with the president on anything, or if you countenance his behavior, which I don't think that we ought to normalize.
Every other Republican must now look in the mirror and ask themselves whether they have the courage to do what Jeff Flake and Bob Corker have done.
I mean, Flake's now announced he's part of the resistance, and good riddance. We don't need him. It's fine.
Let me put it bluntly. Left to his own devices, do you think the president is a threat to national security?
I think that there are people around him that work in an effort to contain him.
Anna, as I mentioned at the open, have media organizations largely portrayed Jeff Flake and Bob Corker, both of whom are retiring, as courageous for their stinging criticism of President Trump?
I don't think so. I mean, I think there's a lot of focus on this for two reasons. One, they're saying what a lot of members of Congress are saying behind the scenes, but they're coming forward. Again, it's this thing on tension. There's a fight here brewing in the Republican Party, and we love nothing more than to cover a good story about a fight.
Are they also saying things that journalists and commentators have said both publicly and privately, and they can say, well, look, this is not us being biased. I mean, look at Corker and Flake. Trump's reckless, he's chaotic, he doesn't know the issues, and it gives them cover.
Yes, I think that's exactly it. I think Jeff Flake and Bob Corker are very convenient proxies for reporters who, the majority of whom would never consider themselves partisan, but don't like Trump. And when they're speaking this elevated language about civility and decency, they become, I think, really convenient proxies for reporters who celebrate them, I think, as heroes. And we don't hear a lot about the Democrat civil war, I should add.
Yeah, but, well, first of all, there is tension on the Democratic side, too, but you never see, I mean, this is news. I mean, when two senators do this. And I think the other side of this is, if you are a reporter and you're hearing from Republicans on the Hill behind the scenes, off the record, the same exact stuff, then it's fair to convey that these people are heroes or courageous for stepping forward.
And a member stepping down in the middle of Congress is very, newsworthy, noteworthy, doesn't happen.
Oh, yeah, no, I absolutely agree that it deserves a lot of coverage. Just the way it's framed, President Trump, one of many tweets, let's just put one of them up, Bob Corker, who helped President O give us the Banner Ram deal and couldn't get elected dog catcher in Tennessee, now fighting tax cuts. You know, a lot of this, though, the narrative has been, well, Trump is attacking these people, but in both cases, Bob Corker was on a bunch of morning shows before the latest round. He calls him Little Bob Corker. In other words, the president was attacked and he counterpunched. You can argue whether he counterpunched too much. So does it seem to you like that both sides want this fight?
Certainly you don't see Bob Corker or Jeff Flake shying away from the kind of dialogue and the back and forth that clearly propels them into the dialogue and kind of driving the narrative.
But now there's a second wave of stories and a lot of columns being written that says, well, you know, Flake and Corker, they didn't make their harshest criticism until they didn't have anything to lose politically. They both announced they're not running for another term, and they were safely out of the political fray. And so they're not so brave after all.
Well, and I think that's all fair because, look, if you go back, especially with Bob Corker, who was in contention for a VP slot, and you know,
and Secretary of State at one point.
Secretary of State, and so yeah, they both of them sort of, if you're of that mindset, you can say enabled the Trump phenomena, and so now that they're facing really tough battles electorally, how brave is it really? I think that's a fair point.
But I don't know. I would also just point out that if you look at Jeff Flake, part of the reason why he couldn't win re-election was because he wrote a whole book about this. Yeah, I mean, so he was brave. Maybe we weren't paying attention, but he certainly has been out there for a long time.
Now, some pundits, Joe, say that this is actually, these retirements are a win for Donald Trump because he's getting rid of two senators who clearly not just frustrated him, but have very strong feelings against him. And of course, it all depends on whether the Democrats end up winning those seats or not. So could this be seen as Trump taking over the party and other people are having to leave Washington?
He took over the party. Party's taken over. I mean, that's what. These are two wins for him, but that's why there is still a struggle in the party, because you look at the polling data, 67% of the party picked Trump, and the rest. In
terms of the coverage, is this being properly cast as a deep divide in the Republican Party?
Yeah, well, one is it is being properly cast as a divide. I think most coverage has been it was brave and courageous for these guys to do it, and not so much that this was a big win for Donald Trump, because it was.
Bingo. All right, Joe Trippi, Emily Jashinsky, Anna Palmer, great to see you all this Sunday. Ahead, The New Yorker reports on another actress accusing Harvey Weinstein of rape. Is all of this producing a change in the culture? But up next, the Vice President's former top spokesman is here with his take on coverage of the White House and what we're calling the Republican Civil War. With the Russia investigation and the political wars heating up, joining us now is Mark Lotter, who recently stepped down as Vice President Pence's top spokesman, is now a surrogate for the president's outside political efforts. So this story about Hillary Clinton and the Democrats funding the firm that ended up procuring this unverified Trump-Russia dossier, I love that word, was broken by the Washington Post. Does that not show that the mainstream media are sometimes willing to go after the other side, not just Republicans?
Well, when you look at what you saw on CNN and MSNBC happening later this week, they were blaming this all as fictitious creation of Fox News, yet they ignored the fact that it started with the Washington Post. I mean, this is just another example of the fundamental disconnect between some of the media who've abandoned reporting for resisting, and why one of the reasons why, you know, when you look at just about every single day part, Fox News here has larger audience and bigger ratings than MSNBC and CNN combined.
Blaming Fox News, I'm shocked. Speaking of CNN, we mentioned earlier that I want to get your take on this as a former reporter. So CNN has this story based on a source. Robert Mueller has a first indictment, and now it's sort of been confirmed it's going to be announced Monday. Hours and hours and hours of talk and chatter. We don't know who it is. It could be a small fish. It could be a big deal. What do you make of that kind of sort of endless speculation with the key missing fact?
Well, I think one of the things you have to look at is who leaked potentially confidential and sealed grand jury information, if that is in fact what happens tomorrow. But the other fact is again, you've got some liberal outlets jumping to conclusions, speculating on what it could be when we don't know. I mean, as anything we have seen in past from these special investigations is that they rarely actually ever result in charges or issues that are related to what their original charter was. It usually is something else completely unrelated to what they were originally looking into. And so we just don't know at this point.
Now, I'm not trying to outlaw speculation on television, but, you know, the identity of the person who allegedly, supposedly is going to be indicted, obviously is a very big deal. Let me move now to this internal battle within the Republican Party. President Trump going after Jeff Flake and Bob Corker, who went after him. In fact, they started it. They're both retiring. Does that create what the White House would call a distraction from other issues? For example, the president having his big presentation declaring a public health emergency on opioids, because the press loves these intra-party fights.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I heard Ari Fleischer say it the other day on Fox. He was saying there's always about a dozen lead stories on any given moment going on at the White House. And so work on tax reform, work on repealing and replacing Obamacare, all those things continue regardless of what may be, being discussed in the media. But the one thing, and I'll say I've got faith in these elected leaders, all of them, on the Republican side, that when it comes time to voting on something that the president and that other Republicans have been talking about for a very long time, like tax cuts, reforming the tax system, that's something that they're going to have to vote for.
So you don't buy the distraction argument, the idea that a lot of the media oxygen is consumed by the political sniping, less on the issues that the White House is pushing?
If legislation was actually done on personality and relationships, Obamacare would already be repealed because John McCain would have voted with his good friend Lindsey Graham.
All right,
they do it on policy.
Okay. Now, as I mentioned, you had worked until recently for the vice president. Do you think Mike Pence, on balance, has been covered fairly, or has there been an attempt by some in the press to drag him into the Russia story, even saying he knew something or he should have known something, and somehow to get him involved in that narrative?
Well, I think there's always this tendency to try to draw distinctions between the vice president and the president on any given issue. We saw this during the campaign, during the early times in office. And
Pence makes it hard.
And he makes it very difficult. But the one thing people don't really understand, and I think some in the national media are actually starting to get this, is the remarkably close relationship that the president and the vice president have. They are in constant communication with each other. They've become good personal friends. And what you're seeing is that the vice president is probably one of the biggest champions out there for the president's agenda. And so I think a lot of that narrative has shifted recently into more of how do we get that moving
In
forward.
10 seconds, has the press, by and large, covered Vice President Pence fairly?
I think they have. There have been a few instances where I would question it, but by and large, I would say yes.
All right, we've got it on tape. Mark Lotto, great to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks very much for coming in. Ahead on Media Buzz, the president says the press makes him look more uncivil. Is that true? But first, sexual harassment allegations have now rocked Hollywood, MSNBC, Fox News, even a 93-year-old former president. We'll take a closer look next. The flood of sexual harassment allegations has now reached the program Morning Joe. MSNBC suspended one of its top contributors, Mark Halperin, the co-author of Game Change, over accusations first reported by CNN from 5 women, all unnamed, when he worked at ABC News a decade ago. They say Halperin kept propositioning them for sex or engaged in unwanted kissing and groping. Now more women are going on the record, one telling the Washington Post that Halperin kept pushing her to sit on his lap, all this prompting an abject apology from Halperin.
Our hearts break for Mark and his family because he is our friend, but we fully support NBC's decision here. We want to know more about these disturbing allegations. We want to hear the stories. We need to know what happened, and we're not going to avoid the story just because he is our friend.
Meanwhile, the latest New York Times story on Bill O'Reilly having had his Fox contract renewed after privately settling a $32 million sexual harassment case with former Fox analyst Lisa Wheel, which we reported on last week, has also drawn widespread attention. And more than 50 women have now accused Harvey Weinstein of sexual assault or harassment, with another actress saying he raped her and Ashley Judd going on camera.
I was sitting on the bed talking to Harvey when he pushed me back and forced himself onto me.
I fought with this volley of no's, which he ignored. Who knows, maybe he heard them as maybe he heard them as yeses, maybe they turned him on.
Joining us now from New York is Lynn Scher, who spent 3 decades as a correspondent for ABC News and was the network's first sexual harassment ombudsperson. And Lynn, with these mounting allegations against Mark Halperin, MSNBC, as I mentioned, has suspended him. Penguin Press has canceled the book Game Change, the next edition of it. HBO has canceled the movie that was going to be based on the book. Showtime has dropped Halperin from the circus show. Does all this tell us how much the culture has changed or is changing?
I think it is changing in a way, but keep in mind that the sexual harassment as a criminal thing has only been around for a little bit less than 40 years. When I did my first story for ABC News, it was 1979. I actually looked it up, and I think that Mark Halperin may have been in high school at the time. We've known about this for a long time, but the point is that it's changed in some ways, but the truth is we are talking in many of these cases about a range that goes from sexual abuse and sexual violence and assault all the way down to things that only men wearing dirty raincoats were doing.
Right.
One of my colleagues at ABC had a great line. He said, sexual harassment is just a dignified term for disgusting behavior.
Well, that's an important distinction you make. Let me bring you back to Halpern, who has put out an apology, a second apology. He says he feels profound guilt and responsibility for actions that he describes as crude, aggressive, selfish, and wrong. He said he realized he had a problem, that after leaving ABC he went to counseling, and he hasn't repeated the misconduct. But several other journalists say Halpern's conduct was an open secret at ABC. You worked at ABC. Was that true?
I was not there at the period when these allegations are around that time. And don't forget, I was in a different situation. I was older than Mark, probably more famous than he was at the time. And sexual harassment is always an older person, usually a guy, with a younger, weaker person. You didn't see any charges of sexual harassment against Bill O'Reilly from Barbara Walters. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
It's always somebody underneath them.
Right.
So my understanding now, having spoken to a lot of ABC people, is that these rumors were around, the facts were around, and people did know about it. But Howie, you know as well as I do, why do women not report these things? Because they're afraid, because they want a future, because also they think they're to blame. They somehow believe falsely that they're the reason why it happened, which of course is not true.
Right. Well, it was painful to watch Mika Brzezinski say that she and Joe Scarborough support the suspension of their friend Mark Halpern. We faced similar questions at Fox, first Roger Ailes, then Bill O'Reilly. And, you know, now they're friends of Leon Wieseltier. He is the former literary editor at the New Republic, now reports from ex-colleagues that he harassed so many women with unwanted kisses and crude talk that he was fired from a new magazine that he was going to launch. But since you mentioned that, I mean, did you ever experience this as a younger journalist, and how did you react?
You know, I've been racking my own brain, as all of us have been, and I never experienced it in terms of pay for play, in that you won't keep your job if you don't do this. Was I propositioned? Absolutely. One time I turned in a script around the rim, you know, the U-shaped desk for the evening news. And the executive producer actually said to me, "Why don't you take off your clothes and come into my office and we'll discuss this?" I said nothing. He laughed. I just shoved it off. I mean, what are you going to do?
Right.
I've spent back when I was at the Associated Press, I spent an entire lunch, and a business lunch, where Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, had his hand on my leg.
And you didn't say anything to anyone about it?
I said nothing. I was embarrassed. I was young. I didn't know what to say or do. And that's what we're dealing with. What we're seeing now, because of the strong women who have been brave enough to come out and talk about Roger Ailes, Bill O'Reilly, Mark Halpern, Harvey Weinstein, and Bill Cosby. Because of them, there is safety in numbers. We're seeing a little bit of sisterhood is powerful.
Right, and I think the coverage, let me just jump in, I think the coverage may be giving some women a feeling that they can speak out without being penalized, although it's still a hard decision. So there's a new Ronan Farrow piece in The New Yorker, again on Harvey Weinstein. Daryl Hannah says he sexually harassed her. Right. Annabella Shora, who's in The Sopranos, says Weinstein brutally raped her in his apartment. She slept with a baseball bat for 20 years, and Weinstein's denying all of these physical allegations. And it's getting hard to keep track. I mean, it's Weinstein, it's the resignation of Amazon Studios chief Roy Price, celebrity chef John Besh, 38 women in the LA Times accusing director James Toback. Do you think the media coverage is making it easier for women to speak out?
I really do, and it's funny, on the way over here this morning, I was on Twitter, and somebody has posted, I'm doing a piece, I forget for which publication, about sexual harassment on Wall Street and among big law firms. And so reporters are seeking stories. There's going to be much more of this. We're now in the me generation, stories that used to be too private to tell, too intimate to share with the public. Suddenly we're in a period where privacy is gone. So I think we will hear a lot more about this. But could I just say, every story I did about sexual harassment over the years, when there were settlements, I've just reviewed a lot of them, somebody always says in it, we hope this jury verdict will send a signal.
Right.
This kind of behavior will never be tolerated. That was in 1983, 1992.
Right.
We've had a lot of signals, a lot of crashes. I'm hoping now we'll get some rules and some laws followed.
Let me just briefly ask you about George H.W. Bush. 4 women have now said that the former president was in a wheelchair, patted their bottoms and made a dirty joke. I'm not going to defend it. It obviously made these women uncomfortable, but your point about lumping everyone together, your thoughts on the Bush situation?
I don't find horny old geezers cute.
That's a good soundbite to end on. I think probably a lot of people might agree with that. Lynn Scher, thanks very much for stopping by this Sunday. We do appreciate it.
Thanks, Howie.
After the break, Ed Henry on deck as we look at CNN's report on Robert Mueller's first indictment and the frenzy over the mystery target. And later, more on the Washington Free Beacon's role in funding anti-Trump opposition research. Stay with us. CNN broke a story Friday night that Robert Mueller has brought his first indictment, but didn't know this rather key detail: who was charged. That touched off hours of rather speculative analysis.
From what we know at this point, how serious is this for the Trump administration?
Well, it certainly looks like the dam is starting to break now, Anderson.
And again, we don't know what the charges are or who has been charged or haven't confirmed it, or we're not saying it. How significant a development is this in the Russia investigation?
It's a landmark development.
Is that true? Joining us now from New York, Ed Henry, Fox's chief national correspondent and author of the book on Jackie Robinson, 42 Faith. And here in Washington, Francesca Chambers, White House correspondent for DailyMail.com. Ed, what do you make of CNN and MSNBC? And I guess lots of people are joining in now, spending hours and hours and hours on, what is the impact here when we don't have this crucial mystery? Who exactly is it, if true, that Robert Mueller has brought charges against?
Well, there'll be some Fox viewers who won't like this, but I will say, as a former CNNer, hats off to them on the reporting if it pans out to be true. They were ahead of other news organizations and in saying that there are going to be charges coming, and people should not dismiss that as quote-unquote fake news if on Monday, as we're hearing, indictments may be coming.
No,
and
that's
again,
a legitimate story,
cautious.
yeah.
Yeah, but here's where I thought it went off the rails is we were all watching some of that coverage because we're trying to match the story on Friday night, and you have David Gergen saying, the dam is breaking. Well, we don't know that. You're saying we don't know who's being charged or what they're being charged with. He throws out money laundering. Yeah, that's possible. I underline possible with Manafort and others. Bottom line is you had Carl Bernstein staying on CNN Friday night. Somebody could go to jail for 20, 30, 40 years. I mean, why don't you just say 50 years, Carl? 100 years. It could be jaywalking for all we know, Howie.
Probably slightly more important than jaywalking.
Yeah, probably more than that.
There were a few mentions on Fox. And New York Times and Washington Post the next day didn't have a word because everyone's trying to confirm it. And also, what is it? And that's something that we still don't know.
And you're right. We still don't know that. It could be Paul Manafort. It could be Michael Flynn. It could be someone lower than them.
It could be someone no
related.
one's ever heard
it
of.
Could be the real estate guy for Paul Manafort. But one thing I can tell you is the White House has received no indication that it is someone who works at the White House currently, so a Jared Kushner, or someone who would be very close to the president like Don Jr. And I think that that's a really important point here, is actually going to some of these sources and asking them point blank, is it this person, and getting a response.
I think that's a fair thing to do, to go to the lawyers and try, because you're often, when a defendant knows that he or she's going to face charges, they put out a statement saying they're innocent. That hasn't happened. Also wondering who leaked this. Well, there's been a lot of back and forth this week about the president, Bob Corker, Jeff Flake, and so forth. And a reporter asked the president about this notion that maybe he's being a little too aggressive. Take a quick look.
Should you be more civil as a leader of this country?
Well, I think the press makes me more uncivil than I am.
All right, Ed, so are the media making shy, retiring Donald Trump appear to be uncivil?
No, I mean, look, he does ask for it himself. He goads for these, he's girding for these battles. He goads senators and picks the fights. But I'm not somebody who says he shouldn't be tweeting. He has that, constitutional right to speak out on Twitter, on Facebook, Instagram, or at a news conference like he did there and taking questions. However, I think the president has a point that I've never seen in an entire almost media mob, that no matter what he does, It is wrong. It is crazy. It is uncivil. He is correct in saying that that is magnified and exaggerated. And I would point out, connecting it to the last story on Russia and Bob Mueller, whether these are indictments about real estate transactions or something else on Monday, let's remind everyone, after month, there have not been any charges or proof of collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. And there certainly has not been any evidence that a single vote was changed by the Russians to impact the election, despite all the claims.
Now, the president does sometimes hit people hard on Twitter, but I think what the media often miss or downplay is that he's often punching back against people who've attacked him.
Well, and that you have to understand the context of that question in that press conference. I was there outside on the South Lawn, was about the sparring that he'd been doing with the Gold Star widow. And no one made the president tweet at her. She did go on national television and say that he was disrespectful on the phone call with her. But he was the one who tweeted back at her. And in that news conference, he said he felt he had the right to counterpunch whenever he felt that he was being attacked. But the question there was whether he should have done that on Twitter and whether he should have just said, I'm sorry you feel that way. Right. That's not what I said. Right. Sorry for your loss.
Let me get this time covered. And this is a new issue here, the Wrecking Crew. We can put it up on the screen. Says that Trump and his team are dismantling government as we know it. But Ed, just briefly, a lot of people want smaller government, fewer regulations, and this cover paints it as a terrible thing that the president's doing.
Right. And you know what? It gets at the swamp. It gets at the central part of the president's campaign, which is I was just mentioning the media. I've never seen the media this, gathered together to try to take down one man before. The bottom line to me is the swamp feels threatened. The insiders feel threatened. This president is shaking things up, and people don't like that.
Francesca, Time says this has been done quietly, but the White House brags about it.
The White House brags about
their fewer regulations, trying to shrink the size of government, correct?
No, yeah, of course. They're absolutely they're saying that's what he got brought in to do. That's what the American people elected him to do, was pull out the red tape, withdraw from all of these deals. Absolutely. They're prideful of it.
That is the other side of this debate. Francesca Chambers, Ed Henry in New York. Thanks very much for this joining us today. After the break, Byron York on how he broke the story of a conservative news site financing Oppo research against Republicans. The Washington Free Beacon, as we mentioned earlier, has acknowledged hiring Fusion GPS, the shadowy Oppo research firm that was digging up dirt on Republican candidates, including Donald Trump, though it says it had nothing to do with the Russia dossier later produced by the company. Joining us now is the man who broke that story, Byron York, chief political correspondent of the Washington Examiner and a Fox News contributor. Byron, how did you find this out, and what is the propriety of a news site, even an openly ideological news site, paying an Oppo research firm to dig up dirt on Trump and others?
Well, on the first question, I had been covering this larger issue of the dossier quite a bit. And what happens is, when you do that, you try to get in touch with people who know stuff about it, and you hope that when something happens, somebody will tell you something. And so somebody told me something. As on the propriety of the Free Beacon, this is not the normal practice of journalistic organizations. They don't hire Oppo research firms. They usually hire investigative reporters who do it for the organization.
Right. They go out and try to get sources, but not paying a company to do it.
Sometimes the media group will pair up with another organization completely out in the open. Let's work with the Pew Research firm to find out about Hispanic America.
Sure. But
exactly.
This was secret at a time when obviously Free Beacon is covering this story.
So secret it didn't come out until a subpoena knocked it loose.
Okay. The House Congressional investigation. Now, here's a statement from the Washington Free Beacon. And by the way, we invited the founder, Matthew Continetti, to come on the show. He declined. We stand by our reporting. We do not apologize for our methods. We consider it our duty to report verifiable information, not falsehoods or slander. Now, what about the Free Beacon's funding, and how would there have been somebody who wanted to put a negative hint on Donald Trump?
Well, let me say one thing about the Free Beacon's sort of attitude. When they were very first founded in 2012, they published kind of a manifesto, and they called it combat journalism. So I think they have kind of a martial view toward journalism. Now,
and that's fine. To take a different approach than the crusty establishment organs.
Plenty of publications on both sides that do that. Now, on the funding, they were originally founded as a 501c4 organization, which is a non-profit organization. And then they went private, I believe, in 2014. Now, one of the major funders, or the major funder, is a New York billionaire named Paul Singer, a longtime contributor to Republican and conservative causes, was in the Never Trump camp when this was happening in the fall of 2015 and eventually supported Marco Rubio. So there's no doubt that this kind of came out of the never Trump sensibility that was really picking up steam. Remember back in the fall of 2015, Trump had been leading the Republican race the whole time. Many of the best minds in politics thought that he was going to implode or fall apart or commit some gaffe that would do him in.
People wanted to knock him out.
But what happened toward the end of the year is a number of people began to think, what if he doesn't implode? What's
Let me
happen?
just ask you this, because we have half a minute left. It sounds like it could be said that Paul Singer, this big donor, was using the Free Beacon as a conduit, a secret conduit, to finance and distribute Oppo material on Donald Trump.
It could be said that. That could be said. I don't know. I haven't said it. I mentioned in the article that Singer was major funder of the Free Beacon, but I think that line of causation I don't have yet.
Right. Well, very carefully answered as a reporter, and it's your sources that enabled you to break this story. Other news organizations then jumping on. Byron York, Washington Examiner.
Thank you.
Great to see you. Still to come, CBS gets a new evening news anchor, but very few people notice how the television world has changed. The CBS Evening News is finally getting a new anchor.
Good evening, I'm Jeff Glor at the Coast Guard Air Station Clearwater.
Jeff Glor, who's been a reporter, weekend anchor, and digital host, will be taking over months after Scott Pelley stepped down. Now, Glor seems like a good, solid pick with more of the action moving online, but what's striking is how the era of superstar evening news anchors is over. Tom Brokaw, Dan Rather, and Peter Jennings were succeeded by the likes of Charlie Gibson, Diane Sawyer, Brian Williams. It was a huge story when Katie Couric took the CBS anchor chair. Big controversy, $15 million, new approach to the news. Now, this new crew of anchors is competent, workmanlike, undoubtedly paid a lot less. The big three network newscasts still draw a combined 24 million viewers, but the most lucrative market is morning television. That's Jeff Glor, G-L-O-R. That's it for this edition of Media Buzz. I'm Howard Kurtz. We hope you'll like our Facebook page. Check it out. We post all my columns there, as well as the segments on the show. Also, let me know what you think on Twitter, at Howard Kurtz. And if you want to write to us, mediabuzz@foxnews.com. mediabuzz@foxnews.com. You can't catch the show live, DVR. We'll see you next Sunday. We're back here at 11 Eastern with the latest buzz. Thanks for watching.